Well, thank you for coming along, Adrian. Thanks for offering to give us this talk. Can I hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Right, brilliant. Okay. Well, I suppose first of all, yes, thank you for we're now live, are we, John?
We are, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So apologies for turning up late. I thought we had a half six start, but never mind. Right. So I'm basically Adrian Pauling. I work for BT. I have a very privileged role. I'm one of a small group of people in an enterprise architecture team, and I'm assigned to the National Air Traffic Services account, and my role basically is to take a look at or keeping the National Air Traffic Services operation running from a BT perspective, as a bunch of services that underpin their operation from day to day, and night to night. It is a 24/7, 365 operation, as you can imagine. Some of the earlier versions of these slides, I've had to run them by the National Air Traffic Security people, so there's nothing too sensitive in here. Everything's pretty well abstracted. There's no juicy, techie, giblety type detail, I hope. Unless people are really interested, I'm quite happy to take questions on that sort of stuff towards the end. But this is basically just a high level overview of what they do, what BT does for them, and how it sort of plugs together, hopefully. So NATs are just one of several large enterprise environments that sit on, although they sit on BT's infrastructure, they could sit on other providers' infrastructure. BT are not the only network provider in the UK anymore. It's no longer, following the privatisation in the 80s. We're just one of a number of communications carriers, and indeed bits of the NATS network do use other carriers, but the predominant stuff for the critical national infrastructure, which has a safety of life implication, sit on the bits I'm responsible for as the engineering lead. So what do NATs do? They're actually split into two. It's not that they're schizophrenic, but the main team that I deal with are NATs en route. Now, these are the people who sit in Swanwick and Prestwick, basically talking to pilots as they fly between airports, whereas the NATS services people, another arm, and they're separated for regulatory reasons, Civil Aviation Authority and Competition and Markets Authority. Birmingham Airport, for example, is not a NATS airport or not NATS managed airport, but the company that owns Birmingham Airport consumes services from NATS at a national level. Some of the other airports are NATS owned, like Heathrow, Glasgow, but no, Glasgow may not be, but certainly Edinburgh is owned by Deutsche Bahn, which makes sense commercially to somebody somewhere to have a German state railway company operating another country's airports for them. It makes commercial sense to somebody somewhere. So Edinburgh consume that services just like the Birmingham do. So the NATS, the air traffic controllers in the airports, basically speak to in that control zone, anything up to basically the final approach and final approach on landing and in the takeoffs, and they speak to the aircraft, and then basically hand management of the flight over to Prestwick and Swanwick to deal with aircraft that are at cruising altitudes. The en route network is quite large, as you can imagine. Basically, the network I'm responsible for enables the centre sites to speak to the live air traffic control towers at real time. It also supplies or backhauls the national radar picture so that the national air traffic controllers can see where everything is within the airspace. And you wouldn't guess, but there's a rather large Met Office data feed, so that obviously the controllers, both the local and national, can make decisions on flights to avoid things like thunderstorms, and reroute aircraft accordingly. So the en route operation, as I say, basically Prestwick up in Scotland. They also cover the oceanic control airspace, and that's around, as it says on the slide, a substantial amount of the transatlantic traffic is managed. Whether that's and for management, that just basically means from time to time the ground-based air traffic control will call in with the pilots just to make sure that they're okay. But if the pilots have any onboard medical emergencies or terrorists or any issues on board, that's basically, that area Prestwick will take the lead for any response that's required, such as flight diversions. So Prestwick covers the oceanic bit and a bit of Scotland, northern, if you like, UK north, and Swanwick covers UK south, although it's called London Flight Information Region because obviously most of the flights are sort of for the London area on the whole. What do the air traffic controllers do themselves? You'll be pleased now. For those with a phobia of flying, terminal services is possibly not the best name, but obviously, the air traffic controllers for the takeoff and landings. That's basically where the handover to the national people come in, and at the national level, once you're basically above 10,000 feet, well clear of anything like drones. The main air traffic control, or the national air traffic controllers, basically ensure for safety reasons that aircraft aren't going to fly into each other. So they basically take a look at the radar and will ensure the flight plans. It's all automated, of course. There are programs to do this. For the flight planning purposes, they will ensure separation at suitable distances to ensure that there is absolutely no chance of any sort of mid-air collisions. So there are guidelines for the horizontal, vertical, and time-based separation. Some of that time-based separation, one of the projects at Heathrow Airport a couple of years ago, slightly counterintuitive from a safety perspective, but with more sensors and more accurate positioning equipment, the takeoff between that separation for landings and takeoffs was reduced from 2 minutes between each flight to 90 seconds. What they call enhanced time-based separation, but that actually was just to reduce and just to optimize the number of flights that could use both runways at the time. Unfortunately, in these COVID times, of course, that's no longer a requirement as such. There are a whole bunch of other smaller airports, regional ones that aren't NATs, that do consume services. It's not that makes turn spotty or measle-ridden overnight, but a number of the regional airports and less sort of local airports also consume services from NATs, whether it's just sharing flight planning information online in a sort of virtual private network environment, or radar information that's pushed up and other surveillance information that's pushed out to the various control towers. So what does BT's network look like at either end of the scale? I've been with BT for just over 3 decades, and I've worked in a number of roles within the organisation, and there is a phrase telco carrier class equipment, or core equipment that basically sits in the telephone exchanges. In the 3 decades I've worked with BT, the amount of space that's been liberated through technology evolution in those in the exchanges is phenomenal. Quite a few exchanges are now up for. Some of them are completely up for sale. Others are probably in the next 5 to 10 years. BT itself is rationalising down to about 30 office locations overall across the country, and out of 5,500 different buildings, because those little buildings, or some of those smaller buildings, are now all basically can all fit quite nicely in the street cabinets, which are appearing just as the cable TV systems run on straight cabinets in a not the same but similar technologies. But at the end of it, there are a few core locations in most towns and cities where you get this carrier class equipment where it is big boys computing, big and routing hardware. Some of those chassis, yeah, okay, we don't get many earthquakes in the UK, but we do get them from time to time. But of course, if you're on the US West Coast, San Francisco, Silicon Valley are just waiting for the next one. So they make sure that any of the comms equipment is in pretty, it'll take a fair amount of vibration before it on a mechanical basis. These are very high performance devices. They are, in fact, would you believe, most of these routers work on a derivative of Linux, shock horror, as an operating system, with very specialist line drivers and very specialist line cards and electronics, such that there's always a hot standby processor. If we have one processor fails, then the other one can basically hot standby take over. Things can be rerouted. Dual power supplies on different power phases that can lead to some very interesting discussions with electricians, particularly on earthing, because that can cause some quite entertainment. And some of those line cards, physically in weight, having had one of those in my hands about 2 decades ago, I was reminded that it was worth about £90,000 list price, and it wasn't one of the top end of the range ones. So just the line card of electronics. Occasionally, exchanges there has been instances of exchanges being broken into for some of these line cards, just because they're damn difficult to get hold of and damned expensive at the best of times, even after the procurement people have finished negotiating discounts. And there's just so much silicon on there with dedicated algorithms for routing IP packets and that sort of good stuff. That card physically weighed 25 kilos. There's a lot of silicon processing done on the line cards. So although it's sort of dedicated to network equipment, it's actually has a heavy contribution from the overall computing environment. And those are the type of equipment. Those line cards also have what they call forced air cooling, just to keep the electronics at a sensible operating temperature, because another feature of these things is, unfortunately, if they start getting a little bit too warm, the onboard temperature sensors will say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to shut down because I'm worth more in a working condition than burning myself out because I'm too hot. And from a service provider perspective, that's obviously not a very good idea. Zinc whiskers I've thrown in because that was a really obscure one that I tripped over a couple of years ago. That's something NASA discovered. Those of you who have had to work in or worked in a data center will have worked in raised floors, the cabinets on a raised floor environment and artificial floor tiles where you have special carpet grippers to lift up a floor tile. I have no idea why on the underside of these they traditionally just use zinc. NASA found out in one of their data centers after a series of very, very strange failure modes that if the floor tiles have been left for 15, 20 years, for some considerable time, zinc is a crystalline metal, and the zinc atoms rearrange themselves and the crystal shapes alter, and the shape of literally the metal alters slowly over time in nice, warm, regularly air circulated environments, and it forms whiskers. And eventually those whiskers break and get circulated with the air conditioning. And if you get a small zinc whisker going into a piece of electronics like that displayed, you can imagine trying to troubleshoot and fault the associated carnage from a service operations perspective that short circuits on the circuit boards produce. But it's one of NASA's top 10 risks. It was at the time. The main network for BT, which also acts as a carrier of carriers. I'll apologise. This is almost one of the sales slides. Certainly the slide, the picture on the left gives you an idea of the disposition of the sort of inner and outer core and what they call metro nodes, where those big powerful routers are basically sat that do an awful lot of packet forwarding in between each other on long distance fiber optics. And as I mentioned in that previous slide, lasers physically they enter the fiber optics are aimed at, don't go into the card sideways, they go in at an angle pointing downwards, so you cannot look into them because of the amount of power output, because looking into a laser is probably not a very good idea, particularly the long range ones, because they have to be high powered to get the distance drive. But the overall network, the main core backbone, what they call, or what BT calls 21st century networks, as you can see, national coverage with a whole bunch of regional and then more localized. In fact, those edge pops are now probably about 5,500. It's over 5. It's definitely over 4,500 now. Right on the edge, and those edge things then go out to feed the cabinets, which. So from an enterprise architecture perspective, I basically from the edge of the network to the customer premises. So if NATS was a customer, I basically got a range of technologies I can play with, or I'm privileged to play with as a sort of Lego set or train set. As soon as I hit the edge switches, which are now running 10 gig, and some of the core stuff is already running at 100 gigabits within the national backbone, obviously very specialized electronics and high speed stuff. That then breaks down and out towards the customer premises, the OpenReach DSLAMs, the green cabinets by the roadsides, with the good old copper. But of course, increasingly, more and more fiber optics, BT OpenReach, who I'm not allowed to speak to directly for regulatory reasons, even if they're my own colleagues, to ensure an open playing field that OpenReach provide these services basically to any provider that comes along. So if they want fiber optic connection in, they want copper connections, fiber to premises, fiber to the curb FTTC customer, which is then uses the copper in the last mile from, or that last bit from that Green Street cab to our home premises that I'm talking to you tonight via, or for the heavy duty enterprise networks, point-to-point microwave radio, or even their own dedicated fibers. Now, for some customers, and that's been one of them, on the right-hand side, it gives you an idea of some of the service levels BT will sign up to. So, typically, 99. If it's a point-to-point connection on copper, 2 nines is basically something else that my beloved employers will quite happily sign up to. Not so high. By the time we've gone through telegraph poles and jointing things, the reliability isn't quite there compared to fiber optics. You can have dual paths, and of course there's then a range of different ways of interconnecting customer premises in high availability, and at the bottom, the 5 nines, 2 physically diverse paths with completely separate network equipment and network terminating equipment on the customer premises. In fact, going to 2 different exchanges is exactly what NATS use to underpin their network to gain as best as possible 5 nines. That's a service level that we monitor on and it is reportable on a monthly basis back to the customer, who in turn, of course, because it's if things are lost, if we can't have a radar site or an airport off, those or major airports, if they have fiber smashes, everything basically, the systems on top will sort themselves out, as I'm coming up to. The radio links can be quite entertaining sometimes. I don't get involved in too much detail other than to say I need a piece of virtualized radio string if I can't get glass, because sometimes some of the NATS locations with the radar and air-ground-air communication sites are in geographically challenging locations. The Hebrides and Shetland Islands come to mind at this point, but I'll touch more on the Shetlands a bit later. But some of the radio planning issues, it's just cheaper and easier if you've got line of sight between a telephone exchange, as the one on the left, Thornhill, which is in the Scottish borders, going up to the NATS Green Lowther site, path length, yeah, okay, so have you got line of sight up just above all the sorts of mountains, the hills in the way? Okay, there are range issues with that as well, of course. Sometimes earth curvature has to be taken into account, like the one on the left, and going across water also brings technical radio opportunities, to say the least. It gets some radio engineers quite excited about various reflection paths and all that sort of good stuff, just to get a link from A to B to replace the fibre, or where fibres don't exist, because obviously sometimes it's just a lot cheaper and quicker to put radio links in instead of optical fibres or new subsea systems. Back more in the mainland, as it were, and certainly some of the smaller airports, you had basically treated like small businesses on almost like domestic premises. In fact, it's basically exactly the same infrastructure. So Coventry Airport at Baggington, the control tower will be literally fed off the green cabinet along the road between or just outside Baggington, where all the construction work for the new battery plant is going ahead at this moment. They will have a copper delivery, or perhaps fibre, but almost certainly copper on past performance. There's a range of speeds, and slowly those cabinets, the electronics in them, are, depending how mature you are. Of course, when I were a lad, mobile phones didn't exist. And even in the speeds we're getting now on broadband, in the 90s would have been an absolute dream compared to the dial-up modem speeds used in the 90s. And it's only getting OpenReach are doing their best to keep ahead of the game, but there's only so many street side cabinets they can keep upgrading, and of course everything has to be backward compatible with the old stuff for things like home hubs or business routers that use the same broadband technology. But as you can see there, if you go back from a home, if you treated a home as a control tower, you want a bit of voice, you want a bit of perhaps not a video feed, but surveillance information. Not only radar, but there's another technique I'll come on to. But at the end of the day, it's displaying, you've got information. So it's information display, bit of internet access or VPN access, such that you can handle your flight plans and that sort of stuff. Something that is coming up on the broadband, and in fact I'm talking to you on one of the pilot lines for this thing, Segir, where I don't have I have a PSTN number, but I don't have a voice connection to the network. This is all, if my wife could make a PSTN call at the same time as me doing this quite happily on the same bit of copper, because of the separation logically done back in the network at the exchange end. So and whilst my daughter's watching some Netflix or other video streaming stuff. So there's to the edge of the network, there's quite a lot of quality of service to differentiate voice services from video services from sort of web-based interactions, and in that case, more traditional character-based echo applications, if I'm brutally honest. It's proven tech. If you have to deal with any of the network providers, they'll come in with things called MPLS and carrier Ethernet, and they are subtly different. Ethernet did start out as a radio technology decades ago, and is what is now ubiquitous RJ45 type style interface on the back of your laptops and computers, in the back of the hubs, in the back of TVs, and set-top boxes. It really has evolved quite considerably, and that's all Ethernet type technology, of which this IP stuff, you'll come across virtual networks, which overlay or provide a logical overlay on top of the Ethernet, where you hear this term MPLS, with multi-protocol label swapping, which is slightly more involved, and involves the internet protocol and things like BGP. Ethernet is very good at replacing point-to-point circuits of old. It's got very deterministic characteristics. You know exactly how it's going to behave in terms of latency and delay between A and B on the whole, whereas the IP stuff can be a little bit more fluid for the same parameters, but more flexible because it's not fixed as in point-to-point. Anybody who's done anything to do with IP quality of service to ensure that those differentiated services, as I say, voice and video, expedited forwarding is what they call it, ensure that the particular packets at the Ethernet level, this can be mapped onto the IP network, but both Ethernet and IP can ensure this quality of service, or in Ethernet it's called class of service, but in IP you'll sometimes or quite often hear the term QoS, quality of service. The IP quality of service stuff maps directly onto the Ethernet class of service, and it's just a mechanism within the network to ensure prioritization of specific traffic types. But these are all set in the data packets going across the network. If I start from the bottom, if you're at either customer site or enterprise network or data center in particular, there's a lot of different techniques as you go up and down the hierarchy of equipment, all performing slightly different functions, but that can make fairly rapid routing decisions. And so things like this virtual router redundancy protocol, one of the Internet Engineering Task Force specifications, such that you can virtualize a router between two physical boxes, so that if one box goes down, the other one automatically takes the traffic for the wide area link. Fortunately nowadays, the wide area network is particularly with more and more fiber optics going in the ground, compared to say 2 or 3 decades ago, and there's a lot more copper. The network is a lot more stable than it used to be. It's much higher availability levels. So these techniques are there, have evolved, or have a heritage in trying to keep the network sessions up. And within the network, within an enterprise network or any internet service provider, there's a whole bunch of routers, the ubiquitous fluffy cloud. They then have what they call interior routing protocols to know where particular bunches of addresses are for the end systems within that particular network. And then you've then got at the top the thing that makes the internet work, a thing called border gateway protocol between the different internet service providers, where there's a bunch of techie attributes, again, to say, well, if I lost that link to that internet service provider, then I've always got another one. Is my next preferred path down the routing list. Occasionally you hear about internet blackouts, but on the former role I've had within BT, I've owned BT's internal IP address space, or the Internet Protocol address space, and did a fair bit of work with the RIPE organisation, who coordinates all of the European internet service providers. They've got a stunning example of what happens on their website, going back about a decade after an incident where a devout individual working for one of the other, shall we say, Asian Far East telecommunication companies took exception to a particular bunch of videos on YouTube, and decided that he'd route all of the YouTube traffic to a specific, just altered one of these BGP path attributes advertised from his particular telecom, and YouTube was taken off air within 20 minutes off on a global basis. It took about 90 minutes for that to suss out and rewind, and for other people to react real time. But that's an example of what can go wrong with just the hit of an enter key, but also the power sometimes of just hitting the enter key. If you sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not. But the thing is that the service on the whole stays up, but it might just be redirected sometimes, but there's always the path there. So NATs themselves, they're not the most leading edge of organizations I've worked with. Safety first. Yeah, there is a safety and airspace regulations group. A lot of the networks testing, I inherited the current network about 4 years ago as I changed account teams. We brought in to modernize some of the stuff. They're a very conservative group of people. They like proven technology. Trailing edge, state of the art is probably more than state of the art is possibly more appropriate. Some of the stuff might even belong in Bletchley Park, but the thing is that, hey, it works, and if it ain't broke, and it hasn't broken for decades, then it's a known quantity, and therefore it's safe. And as I've been reminded, I've only had one summons into the IT operations bridge at Swanwick after an implementation of something, or a new provision didn't quite go right. It wasn't, one of my colleagues missed off one of those quality of service parameters, and then one of the other contractors forgot to tell us just how much traffic, network traffic, introducing their new application for flight processing would take up off the network, and we ended up flooding the network, and I ended up on a please explain, and yeah, it's way far from a blame culture. This is our world. Next time somebody hits an enter key and you commit a little bit too much traffic to the network, and it has these consequences, then you hear 90 seconds to safe operating mode yelled across the commissioning bridge call. That basically means that the air traffic controller or the airport director this was only a small airport, you'll be glad to hear, basically has told the controller to suspend all the outbound flights, tell them if they're on the taxiway to stop exactly where they are, handle the incoming flight or anything that's within 5 miles that's definitely going to land, and speak to Swanwick immediately, or as soon as you've spoken to them. Anything beyond 5 to 20 miles out, warn them there may be issues, and then anything beyond 20 miles, speak to Swanwick about potential diversions. And I was showing this in front of a radar screen, and it was, so please don't do that again. And over there is the office of the duty psychologist, because if anything untoward happens, the air traffic controllers need immediate counselling. But there's no pressure. Just please learn from mistakes. Please don't do it again. It's a very interesting environment to work with in that particular perspective. But it is critical national infrastructure. So one of the airports I had to go into in Shetland, Sunborough, has had 3 instances of multiple fatalities of landing. In fact, I was only speaking to a colleague last week who went into Sunborough. He said he preferred not to go in there because it's one of those airports. If you look at it from above on Google Maps, if you land short at Sunborough, you're going to be wet, and because it goes across the peninsula, the southern end of Shetland, if you don't stop in time, you're going to be wet. And it suffers quite badly from crosswinds from time to time, and he did not enjoy landing on the 3rd attempt, looking down the runway as the pilot had to maneuver the aircraft almost sideways to obtain touchdown. So we're okay, but it's a bit windy up in Shetland. Yeah, sometimes we forget how lucky we are a little bit further south of the border. But of course, Sunborough is also basically medical evacuation point for the Shetlands, and therefore critical national infrastructure. You've got to have high availability. The systems that support the flights, the radars, the air-ground air stuff, everything has to be spot on. And availability is absolutely, the availability of information provided to the air traffic controllers is absolutely crucial. So they literally have hot standby systems. So all the radars are basically duplicated. There's always a hot standby. They overlap each other. There's a whole bunch of national air-ground air VHF radio stations, which now basically, would you believe, still doing voice over IP. So this ubiquitous IP stuff to get the voice from the air traffic controllers to these remote locations, all going across the network. And again, it's a hot standby transmitter, and they design the air-ground comms in the same way they design mobile phone networks. There's cells and particular areas of radio coverage. Everything has 2 power supplies, backups, the UPSs, batteries, all that sort of good stuff. And I have to ensure physical diversity to these sites, as previously mentioned. Now, trying to put a single network diagram onto a piece of A4 when you've got 70+ sites, it doesn't quite fit that well. So this is my nearest attempt at doing so. The larger airports and high availability in the bottom right, going up to a number of air-ground air radios sprayed across the network nationally, and radar sites. Ronnie and Reggie, well, if you've got a pair of Cray supercomputers front-ending the main processor at the Met Office, what else are you going to call them? There's a whole number of smaller airports, and we're now modernising some of the older copper-based technology. The interconnections between Swanwick and Prestwick to our geographical neighbours in France, Belgium, and Netherlands. There are other connections as well. You can see the list of applications there. It's not just the whole air traffic system is dependent on a number of specific computing systems, each having their own applications. Things like the Air Message Handling Service, AMHS, basically gives the air traffic controllers the flight information. Basically, call sign such and such is taken off from this airport, landing at that airport, going through past these waypoints at these altitudes. It's a flat text-based thing, but it provides information for the controllers so they know exactly where any aircraft ought to be real time. Direct access voice, basically so the controllers can speak to each other. Swanwick to a specific airport or Prestwick to a specific airport. Flight data processing and tactical operations management, you can imagine, is what it says on the tin. But as you go, the bottom one of radar, yeah, the radar itself, but of course you've also got another suite of applications which are monitoring the radars, because the radars have got to do a complete sweep in 4 seconds. 3.9 seconds or 4.1 seconds and data gets a bit, so the radars are critically monitored, as well as the radar information themselves. So there's management systems and monitoring systems basically to ensure everything's on track, and that's, you know, that again feeds into the IT operations bridge and the air traffic controllers. But radar's not the only picture. I do like Flight Radar 24 sometimes. If you want to play being an air traffic controller, it's quite a scary experience to see just how many, even it's not as bad in COVID times, but yeah, before COVID struck, NATS in the UK airspace would handle up to 8,000 flights a day typically. And to see that all those aircraft displayed on a map near real time, and even on the NATS website, they've got videos of flights, you know, of the number of flights going in and out, and it does make you wonder why or global warming doesn't come as a surprise when you start thinking about the amount of fuel that's burned, perhaps. But in fact, the air traffic controllers, with the radar information, with the weather information, combined with the weather information, try as much as possible to optimize the flights, the actual flight paths, particularly things on the transatlantic. You had stuff coming across the Atlantic will try and ride on the jet stream for fuel efficiency. And likewise, if it's going in the opposite direction, they'll try and avoid the jet stream to avoid the headwind for fuel efficiency. So they do their best to make it a green as an operation as possible. And they're not only dependent, Flight Radar has publicly available information, but that's not the actual data source. If you actually click on an aircraft and take a look at the data source, it'll come back with ADSB, the top thing on that list, top application. ADSB is a radio transponder system sat in the aircraft that all aircraft that go above certain altitudes have to have. They're there. It's basically a system that says, I am this call sign, I've listened to my GPS and my GPS is telling me I'm at this longitude, this latitude, this altitude. I think the time is this. Please don't fly into me. Please avoid me. So it's another safety mechanism. But ADSB, because it's radio based, you can actually, if you're geeky enough, you can buy ADSB receivers and listen into the sorts of messages going on. And that's the real, if Flight Radar 24 displayed all of the information of flights, you'd get to see all the military stuff. And I think that the RAF and particularly the US Air Force would probably not like their flight paths disclosed in public. So to end up, one of the site visits I've had to do, as I alluded to, having had to go to Shetland, because you can imagine trying to modernise some of the infrastructure in these remote places can be quite entertaining. So the National Air Traffic Network is actually co-located at one of these ADSB sensors, is actually at RAF Saxe-Voord, which is the most northerly radar location at the very top end of the country, at the very top end of Shetland. Now, yeah, on the opening slide, I sort of said had Scilly's to Shetland. Originally, it was Scilly's to Saxe-Voord, but I don't think anybody will have heard of Saxe-Voord until I've mentioned it. It's at the very top end of Shetland. It's sufficiently far north that at the solstices, you had December 21st, North Shetland, or even Shetlands, are sufficiently far north that they might get as much as 6 hours of daylight. Likewise, in June, they will get 18-20 hours of daylight. It's actually just 4 degrees. On the RAF site at Saxe-Voord is just 4 degrees from the Arctic Circle. It's further north than Bergen. And it's not that it's a little bit bleak and rugged up there, but as you can see from some of the photographs, it's a unique environment. It's almost a microclimate at the top of a hill. Pretty windy. I thought they were taking the mick when they said you could come and bring the bloke from Shetland Telecom. There is such an organisation. It's one bloke, one of the blokes in the high-vis jackets, who said if I could get him into this site, he'd give me a lift. So that was game on, which is how I ended up there, along with to see essentially doing the site inspection for some of the NATs and MOD equipment. That's our matrix responsibilities for. When we opened the car door and hit in the face with small stones, we thought, okay, perhaps it is a bit windy up here. Yeah, and perhaps now we appreciated why we have to have the building site gear on and hard hats, and it wasn't just the fact that they're still doing building works for the fencing. As the gentleman sort of met us at the door, yeah, hi, I'm Brian, I think it was, or whatever, from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I'm the hostile environment specialist. I built the previous British embassies at Mogadishu and Kabul, and now I'm doing RAF Saxe-Vaud. To which it was well, how many opium doped up towel-headed terrorist type, with respect, do you get up here? There's not even 400 people live on the island. No, it is a hostile environment, but not that way. It's only a steady 45, 50 mile an hour at the moment. It holds the UK unofficial land wind speed record. It's 197 miles an hour wind sustained. It's unofficial because, of course, they haven't seen the sensor since. They've lost the radome into the North Sea on 2 occasions. Next door to the radome is a Maritime and Coast Guard aerial array to listen out for ships in distress in the North Sea. That's been flattened by the winds as well. There are no trees in Shetland for a reason. They just can't grow in the winds. But it is the most northerly broadband deployment on the BT broadband network. There may be a farmhouse that might be a few meters a little bit further north and a bit to the east, but yeah, that's the very top end, literally the top end of the network. That's all I had. I hope that was of interest. Not too, of course, with everybody's mics muted, I can't hear anybody snoring anyway, so but I'm quite happy to take any questions at that point.
Adrian, but you put up a slide showing the separation between aircraft, and it said 3 to 5 nanometers.
Nautical miles.
Oh, nautical miles. Thank you.
Yes, nanometers would be distinctly worrying.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Thanks.
Yes, no, yes. So,
Come on, everybody, unmute your microphones and ask questions.
So
I've got a question for you, Adrian. Because everything now has gone to these street cabinets, if there are there ever problems to do with temperature fluctuations and things where things switch off, and what do you do about those?
So this is more to do with the specification of the electronics in the street cabinets. Certainly in the COVID lockdown situation, I just received one of the competitors for BT, their street cabinet around the corner from me. The fans got busy to try and keep it cool because everybody suddenly started home working, and yeah, there is, even in the street cabinets, they do have fans to do a bit of air circulation. It works both ways. Obviously, they have to be waterproof and weatherproof, but they also act as heat sinks. And there are some specialist and earthing techniques. Some of the research that went in, would you believe, some of that was done for OpenReach, conductive concrete, to ensure that the street cabinets were earthed properly, as well as connected to the local grid earths. The specification for the equipment in the cabinets is such that it has almost a sort of military operating temperature range, because we've just had a cold spell. We've had one or two other cold spells. So the equipment will have to work in over a range of something like -10 to +40 degrees centigrade by default. If I answer a couple of questions, or any questions, okay, oh dear, now the questions are flowing in. First, so Simon, yes, Birmingham. I don't think it really can. Well, it's a regional airport, but it's not. It's not in terms of it does handle international flights. I'd say, but East Midlands Airport's probably more a regional airport, except that there's so much cargo stuff going in and out of East Midlands at the moment. It's probably busier than Birmingham, believe it or not, particularly late at night.
I do believe that at the moment, yeah.
Yeah.
It just wasn't on the map. I just wondered why that was.
Somebody's not very good at drawing maps.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. 5G via airplanes. Ooh. Well, I think that was. I really don't know, to be honest. Probably not, because with on board, it's I'm working inside a telco. I'm seeing and obviously BT Group, I've told EE and all that sort of good stuff. Yeah, but equally I've seen quite a bit of research work with Vodafone in the Coventry area as well, to do with 5G, particularly some of the autonomous vehicle work going on. That is beginning to explore use of 5G telecommunication systems for autonomous vehicles. Now, at an autonomous vehicle level, yeah, there's going to be data sharing, but that's for the more for the vehicle itself. Of course, something that might be announced more formally a bit later in the City of Culture for Coventry. It may well be that it becomes a centre for research for drone aircraft carrying passengers. And for passenger aircraft 5G, yes, everybody's got their handsets. At which point within the aircraft itself are they ever going to allow us to use Wi-Fi? So Wi-Fi and 5G. Via airplanes, it's quite possible to put. In fact, Google have had a project that they've just terminated a few weeks ago for balloons, creating high altitude platforms, and they've investigated the feasibility of basically suspending what essentially come up as super base stations, floating at around 60,000 feet up, which is a good 10,000 feet clear than most of the most civilian airliners anyway. So there's a bit of air-ground communication links, and of course, if you use balloons, they're very good for rapid deployment in earthquake situations and recovery, natural disasters. But via airplanes, via drones, quite possibly, but via airplanes themselves, civilian ones, not quite at this moment, although it's a technology that might begin to surpass some of the fibre optics as radio techniques just get refined and refined. It's a continuing field of very strong academic research, and I'm already hearing of 6G on the horizon, definitely. Is this technology scalable? Yes. It's all based on the internet stuff, which was designed to be scalable. Yeah, I've dealt with IPv6 2 decades ago, and we still haven't rolled out IPv6. We were all going to, along with the Y2K issues. Yeah, but the whole internet protocol has made everything considerably scalable. Although IPv6 is actually beginning to roll out, and everything works, it has scaled with a few bodges here and there, but it's been made to work. And I think the technology, well, is demonstrably scalable on a global level. Yes, first world flying port for Coventry. That was exactly what I was alluding to, Margaret. You'd be surprised. Well, it wouldn't. I've still occasionally get exposed to some of those core routers, and the very expensive ones. Yeah, they probably are a bit lighter for the same throughput, but then again, by the time we've got to the, if you're doing multiple 100 gigabit Ethernet ports, or some of the leading edge research for fiber optics are now doing terabits down a single fiber. It's, yeah, they can still be quite heavy cards. They may, I think you're right, hopefully they're not 25 kilos, because there's a fair amount of mechanical robustness at this point that's required as well. They don't easily slip in and out of the equipment chassis, but and they almost become two-man handling. But most of the standard line cards are a lot lighter. Yeah, and the stuff that you get in major offices and you know, industrial and academic type environments, production type. It only tends to be in the core of the network where the physically heavy duty stuff gets deployed. I think I've covered everything. If I haven't, please throw a question out. Yes, world's first airport flying is noted. I've seen that announced elsewhere, but I think they're making a formal announcement, possibly with I think it's Hyundai, Coventry City Council and central government. I'm not sure which part of central government, but they may well. Now we've got a nice new, or we're on target to have a nice new bright shiny battery centre at Whitley. It won't necessarily only be for a certain car manufacturer next door. They could well be used for drones. And in fact, some of the drones, there have been trials last year with the COVID stuff. My beloved employers are involved in setting up a small project to look at drone deliveries. Whilst this was scoffed at 2 or 3 years ago for a certain well-known parcel delivery company. It's a bit more than that now, of course, nowadays. This has become reality, and certainly medical supplies to Isle of Wight and the Isle of Mull in Scotland have been done with have been done on a regular basis for the NHS via drones, but obviously with sort of qualified pilots in controlled conditions. Some of the other unmanned aerial vehicle stuff can be quite interesting if you stray into the military environment where they've also got drones. Counterintuitively, there are voice communications to the big boys and girls radio controlled aircraft. They all have some of the larger UAVs that the US and RAF, US Air Force and RAF have. Typically have about 150 megabit feed each, network-wise, most of which is the payload for whatever they're up to. But there's a certain amount reserved for the camera on board at the front of the aircraft, and would you believe voice comms, so that the remote pilot can speak to the local air traffic control tower when they're doing takeoffs and landings. So it's going to be, which is a bit counterintuitive to have a voice service for an unmanned aerial vehicle. But I think the stuff that's going to be going on in Coventry, hopefully, is going to be what seems to be emerging area of almost air taxis for vertical takeoff and landings and short hops. So perhaps there's a landing pad that can be built in the central Coventry to Coventry University. And University of Warwick and to the airport, it's going to be, I think there's a rich stream of research work there, which will keep the academics well and truly off the streets for some time to come. But I could be opinionated.
Any more for any more?
I'm genuinely surprised I've not had to take a sip of water. yet.
I've been glugging mine all evening.
Well, I hope that was relatively interesting and informative, because it's not the sort of thing that many people get a glimpse into from time to time, which is why I volunteered to do it. It is quite a privileged job in many respects, and quite interesting. At least I think it is, but I'm biased.
I found it quite interesting because in '75 I was doing radar. Between '77 and 2001, I was in telecoms. Then I did flight software, engine management software for Rolls-Royce. so there's an awful lot in your talk that I followed and remembered from various past jobs.
Flashbacks.
Yeah.
I've had talks with through one of the other local institutes, well, the IET, occasionally, because I'm in both camps, or foot in both camps. As I speak to the Rolls-Royce people, a couple of years ago, they had a very interesting. I was at one level, I was surprised when the guy said, "Yeah, and if you strap an iPhone on the outside of an aircraft and go across the Atlantic, by the time you land, it won't work." And the same applies to the engine management systems, obviously, unless they're protected. The solar radiation, even at 40,000 feet, is enough to destroy the very sensitive electronics that we all now carry around in the ubiquitous mobile phones, which is why I'm slightly dubious about 5G in fire airplanes. The electronics is very sensitive to those stuff like solar radiation. So it's quite useful that we've sat in a bean can, as it were, in an artificial pressurized atmosphere.
If it puts your mind at rest, the technology controlling the Trent series Rolls-Royce jet engines was designed in the 70s.
It's proven.
Yeah. It's probably radiation hardened as well by default. Yeah.
I did end up mentioning with the Rolls-Royce guy, he reaffirmed there's an incident where a new flight crew, as they were commissioning an Airbus, it literally rolled out the production line, hadn't even taken off, and the air crew had taken it over on behalf of the airline, but they hadn't read the flight manuals, or they weren't awake to their commissioning procedures. And they got the engine, they sort of began to program the flight, and they put the throttles back, and then there's another button on the thing, a ground proximity alarm detonating. And it just switched the alarm off. And because of the fly-by-wire systems overriding the ground proximity alarm, the flight management or the engine management system then thought, well, I'm only going at about 4 or 5 knots cruising out of the hangar at this point, but hey, the ground's been taken away from me. I must be at 30,000 or 40,000 feet. Therefore, I'm about to stall, and I better go onto full throttle.
Yeah.
$200 million worth of Airbus written off as it went into the far wall.
Oh, right, yeah.
Ouch. So sometimes these man-made things, nobody killed. It just fortunately light injuries, but it did recount that the flight they couldn't, because the aircraft had never been treated in that fashion before, and they didn't expect people to turn the ground proximity detector off. They couldn't. There was no engine shut off either, because I'm in the air. You can't shut me off.
Right. Yeah.
So it gone into the crash wall, and it had to be left there for 30 minutes. The frantic calls to Rolls-Royce. How do you turn these things off? Yeah. They're going at full pelt. We've had a prang. Well, sorry, you can't turn them off. If from what you described, the plane still thinks it's at 30,000 feet. You're gonna have to let it sit there and burn all the fuel off. Oh dear. You learn by mistakes. Some of them, if you read them,
RTFM.
if you don't RTFM, some of them can be quite expensive.
Yeah.
But that's human error.
I hope that wasn't an A380, Adrian.
That might have been an A320.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't an 80. It was a Middle Eastern airline concerned. At Toulouse, they kept quiet about it in case it came across as racist in any way, shape, or form, which probably is a wise move. But there are pictures on the internet, unfortunately. It did sort of leak out. Although I think they must have heard IT trade-wise, I do look at the register. They had a stunning article a few months back about a gentleman, again in France, who'd worked on the Rafale interceptors for most of his career, or on jets as an engineer, and for his leaving, his retirement present, he was given a ride in a Rafale fast jet. The only trouble is that because he'd never actually flown in anything he designed, which is fine. And because the ground briefing crew were very excited to meet one of the engineers who designed these things. So unfortunately there were one or two shortcuts taken, and he wasn't fully strapped into his seat properly, and they didn't connect up various bits properly. The takeoff was fine, but with the fast jet, the pilot did a typical military takeoff, pulled the stick right back, not your gentle 5 or 10 degrees that, of course, we mortals endure, but basically pulled 4G at a climate of something like 45, 50 degrees. At which point this guy, because he hadn't been strapped in properly, was thrashing around and, of course, reached down to the bottom of his seat to grab hold of it so he had something to hold on to, and pulled something up. His spine's about a couple of centimetres shorter as a consequence. It very soon became a cabriolet Rafale jet.
Oops.
But,
Well, have we got any more questions?
Um,
I think not. Is anybody there? Oh, we've still got 22 participants.
Yep. Brilliant.
yeah.
Somebody's quickly Googled that. Yes, I wasn't going to mention the airline concerned, but yes, I knew it was an Airbus, and it was thanks to that PJA. Yes.
Right, well then, thank you, Adrian. It's most interesting. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the talk.
No trouble.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to share the scars of experience with people who are vaguely prepared to listen to me.